We have an unidentified flying object.
Researcher on a mission with Dr. J. Andy Elias.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I am your host, Dr. J, and co-hosting with me tonight, live in London, where it's 3 a.m., is Johnny Webb. And as always, we have a fascinating show for you today. But before we introduce our guest, let me give you some UFO news. Of course, last week we talked about these UFO photos that were released anonymously, but I guess the person stepped forward. Last week, the title was that Navy UFOs from 1971 prove aliens exist. The title today is Navy Arctic UFO photos leaked by anonymous source. This comes from Open Minds, but like I said, this is not quite new news. There's just more photos now. And of course, UFO sightings in Manitoba date back to 1792. I'm not that surprised, and I'll tell you why. I've seen those cave paintings from 18,000 years ago. There's even some that go back to 30,000 years ago that show weird people and things in the sky. So obviously that's not new. As a matter of fact, it's alleged that George Washington himself had a sighting. This last one has something to do with Monday night show, Tuesday's special live update, as well as yesterday's special with Richard Hoagland. And that happens to be the Pluto mystery. 4 huge identical holes found on the dwarf planet stun NASA scientists. Why? That doesn't surprise me. Well, I guess more data will come. And as Mr. Hoagland said himself, it'll take us at least 6 months to get all the data because of how far it's transmitting from. With that being said, let's go ahead and introduce today our very special guest, the one and only Mr. Andrew Basiago. Andrew, you with us?
Yes, I am, Dr. J. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. It's been quite some time that we've been meaning to do this, and I'm finally glad we're able to do it. And for all those who don't know you, I think the first time the word chrononaut was coined was regarding you. Am I right?
Well, I popularized it, I guess, in the same way that Buckminster Fuller didn't originate, but popularized the word geodesic dome. Chrononaut, as far as we're able to tell, emerged in a 1962 American science fiction novel. But it was science fact when we began time traveling in the late 1960s. And it's a term that I'm seeking to popularize primarily because I believe that the cadre of chrononauts that emerged in the late 60s and early 70s deserve the same status as the astronauts. And by the way, they did not just include Americans. There were also, for example, British and Russian chrononauts.
Now, let's go back to the Project Pegasus, because when do you think the first time travel experiments began? Was it Philadelphia experiment? Was it before that? How does Montauk fit into all this? I mean, I want you to explain it to everybody out there listening as if they've never heard this information before. So essentially, let me go back to that initial question. When did time travel for humans begin?
In antiquity, we know that because we know that when DARPA established Project Pegasus in the mid to late 1960s, they created an intelligence funnel in which they put, for example, the experimentation by the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Egyptian civilizations in time travel, as well as foreign technology from the Nazi German and the Soviet Russian experimentation, as well as reverse engineered extraterrestrial technology. So for as long as we've been visited by extraterrestrials, which goes back thousands of years to antiquity, maybe even to the propagation of life on Earth, time travel has existed somewhere in the cosmos because it was utilized, it has been utilized for extraterrestrials to reach our planet across the vast reaches of space and time, namely time-space. In the modern era, I would say sort of in the post-industrial revolution Earth civilization that we're living in, I think we can identify a significant point in terms of Nikola Tesla's stay in Colorado Springs, Colorado in 1899, because we know that he was beginning to experiment with vortal teleportation during that famous stay in Colorado Springs. And we know also that my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, repeated those teleportation experiments at the Thomas A. Edison Research Laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey, where my father worked between 1956 and 64. So there were precursors. Now, you mentioned a very important chapter in time travel history, which is the so-called Philadelphia experiment. After Nikola Tesla's death on January 7th of 1943, later in 1943, there was a time travel experiment that was undertaken utilizing Tesla's teleportation technology. But the Philadelphia experiment story that has come down to us is the cover story that was scripted by the Office of Naval Intelligence. So, for example, it wasn't an experiment into radar invisibility involving the Eldridge as the classic storyline and the one that was recapitulated in the movie and so forth in 1984 told. It was, in fact, an experiment involving utilizing Tesla teleportation to move a ship called the Martha's Vineyard away from, in light of the fact that the Nazi Navy was beginning to chain ordnance to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So, in other words, it was the direct application of Tesla teleportation technology. And all of the other major facts that have come down to us in what I call the Philadelphia experiment cover story were alterations of the original facts to conceal the critical linkage between Tesla, teleportation, and the Los Alamos physicists, and by that I mean the Manhattan Project physicists, who during and after the war were publicly touting their advances in building more destructive atomic bombs, but concealing the time travel research that they were undertaking at the same time. So there was a Philadelphia experiment, but all of the facts were changed. The ship didn't go back to Norfolk, Virginia. It went back to Newport News. The experiment wasn't undertaken in Philadelphia Naval Yard. It was undertaken in Long Island Sound. The individuals who have variously been identified as being involved in the experiment, Tesla, John von Neumann, Albert Einstein, were not at the helm of the Eldridge, but in fact two Manhattan Project physicists, J. Robert Oppenheimer and Edward Teller, were at the helm of the Martha's Vineyard. And there we have the effort that was made to conceal that fact, to conceal the fact that after Tesla's death, his paperwork was seized by two War Department officials who forwarded his documents, his schematics, his formulae onto the National Archives under the Alien Property Act, and then sent them to the most logical place on the planet to send them, which is where the world's leading physicists and electrical engineers were then gathering in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to build the atomic bomb. And that's where Tesla's paperwork is today. The papers of Tesla were never lost. They are still located at Los Alamos, and that essentially is the hidden history of the Philadelphia experiment, and indeed the larger history of the U.S. development of time travel, which is to say that time travel was the secret twin of the Manhattan Project, and it was undertaken by the Los Alamos physicists.
I'm glad you talked about the Tesla papers. I got a few comments to make on what you said. That first of all, you're right. They were never missing out. People, I think his niece said that the moment right after he passed away, federal agents went to his hotel room and literally took away all his notes. So I wouldn't be surprised that they're sitting with, some government scientists somewhere or military scientists. Another very interesting, you said, the way extraterrestrials travel is via time travel. And that's going back to what Dr. J. Allen Hynek said, where essentially they're skipping dimensions. And Bob Lazar always states that if we can alter gravity, things such as time travel to force fields to teleportation, wormholes, all become a reality. And this is my next question. I've heard a rumor, or from other people who've spoken about this, I don't know if you want to call it a rumor, it's just a suggestion, that we can only go back as far as the first time a time machine was brought here or used here. Do you know if there's any merit to that question, to that statement?
But that's kind of an elision on a practical constraint rather than a sort of a metaphysical certitude. And by that I mean some forms of time travel open up a vortal tunnel in time-space, for example, Tesla teleportation, through which the teleportee is physically passing. After the advent of Tesla teleportation, were we to teleport somebody, sort of shoot them across the quantum bow, and teleport them to a time before the advent of such devices, there was the practical constraint, there was the practical constraint of getting them home to the present, of getting them back from the past. But it doesn't relate in any larger metaphysical way, in almost as if magic, in terms of the fact that there's some cosmic threshold that exists that you can't cross because the machines weren't in existence. It was just simply the practical problem of somebody being stranded in the past without the device to get home. It's not a sort of a cosmic certitude that there's a threshold that when you cross it, you can't time travel to before the invention of the device. That indeed is the problem with some of the devices, is you can't time travel before their development because you will strand the time traveler. That's why we developed, in addition to teleportation, the chronovisors of Ernetti and Gemelli into a holographic way of embedding somebody in a past event, so that when the hologram was collapsed, they found themselves back in the present. That's why Dr. Sterling Colgate, who just passed away in 2013, developed plasma confinement chambers to use radioactive plasma to embed the time traveler in a past event. And then when that localized quantum field effect wore off, the time traveler was spontaneously returned to the present. So it was really very much a practical necessity of stranding the time traveler in the past as a result of not having the device to get home, not some kind of cosmic threshold that resulted from the time that the technology was developed.
You mentioned your father was involved, or he said something about, was it the Tesla papers or about the Philadelphia experiment? What was his involvement with the military, the government, or any of these people associated with these projects that essentially led you into the project which you participated in, which was Project Pegasus?
Yeah, my dad was brought into the U.S. defense community's response to the extraterrestrial presence several months after the famous July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C., by 9 extraterrestrial craft that were clocked on radar at Langley Air Force Base as traveling at 7,000 miles per hour, which was far beyond our flight capability at that time. Specifically, he was approached at his job at the Okanite Company in Paramus, New Jersey, to report the next Monday, this was in October of 1952, to work on the ramjet and other high-performance jet engines and jet aircraft. On the ramjet project, my father designed the metal alloy by which the ramjet was built, so that when it would be traveling at supersonic speeds in our atmosphere, it wouldn't melt from friction with molecules of air, and when it went outside the atmosphere of the Earth into the near space environment, the plane would not melt from friction as a result of the plane's contact with particles of space dust. And that was a task that my father accomplished. He found an alloy that, I don't know what it was, but I remember him discussing this. He found an alloy that worked, and so that we would be able to build the ramjet engines. So that brought him into the classified defense-related research realm, where our response to the performance criteria that we saw above Washington, D.C. in July of 1952 involved. And that was an extraterrestrial presence that, for example, could not only travel at very fast speeds, but be seen at one location in the sky above the Capitol and then blink off and suddenly appear elsewhere above Washington, D.C. In other words, those craft were seen to be teleporting. They were seen to be time traveling above our nation's capital. During the 1956 to 64 period, following on that event and his involvement in classified defense work, my father was asked by the U.S. government to repeat Nikola Tesla's experimentation with teleportation from 1899 and onward until his death in 43, during those years at the Edison Labs. And then by the mid-1960s, when there was a push to create this intelligence funnel into which everything that would yield a time travel capability would be placed, that intelligence funnel becoming DARPA's Project Pegasus, certainly by 1967-68, my father at that point was one of the country's leading experts on the theory and practice of one of the technologies, Tesla teleportation. And so by the time I was brought in informally into Project Pegasus in winter of 1968, when I first teleported between New Jersey and New Mexico and back with my late father, and then when I was brought in officially as a child participant in the fall of 1969, which was the beginning of my third grade year, my father's role was essentially as the chief technical consultant between the Ralph M. Parsons Company, the prominent engineering firm, and the CIA on the theory and practice of teleportation.
Obviously, he felt safe enough to send his son through this process to teleport through time. Otherwise, he wouldn't have chosen you as his test subject, right?
Very much so. My dad was not placing my life at any greater risk. He was probably placing it at lesser risk than I would have experienced flying in a commercial airliner or taking an automobile from point A to point B. I was brought in at a time where several years had passed, and Navy enlisted personnel had already been utilized to test the capability of teleportation, as well as a cadre of disadvantaged kids from Latin America, where our government was negotiating with the corrupt, authoritarian, right-wing regimes of Latin American countries, and they made this Faustian deal where they would bring, basically street urchins off the streets of major capitals in Latin America, and if the kids survived the classified defense development testing that they were subjected to, they would be given, the Faustian deal was that they would be given everything that they might not get if they stayed in their home countries. A roof over their head, parents, an education, enough food to eat, enough clothing to wear, and so forth. I was brought in the third cadre of teleportees, and we were basically bright, sturdy, healthy children from stable, intact, church-going families. Now, why was that? That was because one of the programmatic objectives was to test the mental and physical effects of Tesla teleportation on the kind of American children that the children in the first families of the country would be, namely the children of the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, our top military officials, and so on. Because they were anticipating that once they worked out all of the bugs and they had completely reduced Tesla teleportation to a safe form of virtually instantaneous travel, we would be using it, for example, to shuttle the president around U.S. military bases, between U.S. military bases around the world, if, for example, he had to make a state visit in a certain country. Or let's say the Secretary of State had a summit to attend, and we wanted to get our number 3 official there, executive branch official there, without any jet lag. Okay, so they wanted to test, well, what is this going to do to the kids of the president, or the vice president, or the Secretary of State? So I was a lucky kid. I had loving, responsible parents. I was growing up in a garden suburb of New Jersey at a time when I think New Jersey had the second leading public school system in the country after Connecticut. I was the youngest in a family of 7. I was bright. I was physically fit, although not an athlete. I was healthy. And so one of the things they wanted to do is they would test our medical condition and also give us about 2.5 hours of math and verbal problems when we began regularly teleporting between New Jersey and New Mexico in the summer of 1970 when I was 8. So in a sense, I don't like to use the term guinea pigs because they already knew the technology was safe. We were experimentees on one level because they wanted to develop a baseline. Okay, what will this technology do to a healthy kid from a fortunate background? There were other reasons, of course, why they used children. They needed children in the chronovisors because when they used an adult, the holograms would collapse. from the heartbeat, the respiration, the footfall, or an errant cough or sneeze by an adult chronovisee. They knew when we were time traveling that the perceptions of children are more keen. They're more keen than those of adults because children's perceptions are not miscolored by the selection bias of their existing experiences. They use the example of sending an adult, let's say 200 years in the future. If they saw a holster on somebody's belt, the adults would say, well, I saw somebody carrying a firearm in a holster on their belt. But if they sent a child to the same location 200 years in the future, the child would see what was actually there and would say, I saw an adult, in the year 2200 carrying some kind of scientific implement in a holster, like the holsters we would use to carry a pistol. So we were deemed to be more reliable observers of what we would be observing in the past and future. And also quite clearly, we were trainees because they were planning on sending us to the Naval Academy in Annapolis after high school graduation and utilizing our time at the Naval Academy as a pretext, as Donald Rumsfeld said when I was on the project to my father in one conversation, and will use their time at the Naval Academy as a pretext to involve them in additional project activity. So we were, in a sense, time-space cadets that they were educating in the theory and practice of different forms of time travel because we would be doing a lot of it in adulthood after becoming naval officers.
I'm going to ask you two questions. First of all, how many children were involved in Project Pegasus, and what's the furthest they went back, and the latest in the future they went to? Both, I guess. The latest and the furthest. Yeah.
I got this wrong recently at Cable Access in the very city where I practiced law for 20 years, which is Vancouver, Washington. So let me correct this. Overall, I was told when I was on the project and then years later by an individual by the name of Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA, who was briefing me about different aspects of intelligence community activity from roughly 1981 to 2001. His facts corresponded with what I was told when I was on the project, that there were 140 American school children. I also remember being told that the team of 10 that I was the captain of was, that 140 kids was delineated into, was grouped into 14 colored regiments or teams of 10 children. So I was the captain of Blue Team. There was myself and 9 other children. And then there were 14 that were designated with colors to identify those teams. And they were primarily from the Atlantic seaboard, New England, and the Midwest because they had to use teleporting to the west to slipstream us and involve us in project activities in New Mexico and then teleport us home. So they were clearly teleporting from east to west when we began teleporting as a group of kids in summer of 70. But in addition to the group of 10, I often found myself in kind of breakout groups of either 4 children, namely myself and 3 others, or 8. So I don't know where that additional 2 were sometimes coming from. They may have actually been older kids that were sometimes augmenting our group. But basically, nationally, I was told there were 140 kids. I've spoken to about 7 others of them, and they were the ones who were immediately being trained with me at my public elementary school, which was Mount View Road School in Morris Plains, New Jersey, where I was growing up. I spoke with 6 or 7 of those individuals. They all remembered the Montauk chair being in our learning laboratory. And as one of them began to remember teleporting to New Mexico, he panicked and hung up the phone and would not speak with me again. One of the girls remembered being taken up to ITT Defense Communications, where we did a chronovisor probe on November 5th of 1971 to the year 2013 to see the condition of the U.S. Supreme Court building on the Mall in Washington, D.C. So essentially, I reached 6 of those other 9 kids in my group of 10, Blue Team, of which I was the captain. I received specialized training, for example, what to do to protect the kids in the event of a mishap. For example, when we started teleporting to New Mexico, beginning in summer of 70, as a cadre of kids, we were told that there was a chance that we would jump there in 1971, for example, but when we arrived there, it would be 1791. So I received specialized training of essentially of how to pull rank and protect the kids if some kind of catastrophe like that happened. So
I got a question from a listener, then my co-host got a question. Let me read you the listener question first. He goes by the name Wise Frog, and he's in Toledo, Ohio. Andrew, do you know of anyone who can time travel naturally?
yes, actually, we don't know whether spiritual teleportation is a latent, that is to say, a vestigial capability of human beings from our ancestral past, or whether it's an incipient capability of some human beings. But some avatars, such as the Tibetan monks depicted in Lobthang Ramtha's books about the Tibetan Buddhist experience, and most individuals under life-threatening crises can spiritually teleport, and we don't know how they do it. But there's a depiction in Ramtha's book of some of the Tibetan monks descending Mount Everest, in which they're suddenly appearing in one location and then 500 more feet down the mountain and so forth. They were literally teleporting in leaps and bounds down the mountain. When I was doing my second of three major fact-finding trips to New Mexico, where I spent literally 10 days there in 2003, 2004, and 2008. So I've done about a month of field research in New Mexico proving my experiences there. I met a woman named Kathleen who was a bureaucrat working in one of the state office buildings in Santa Fe, who had been struck by a car in the middle of the street, and a man came out from his house and offered to summon an ambulance to save her life. Her skull had been fractured in the accident. She was struck by a car and slammed down on the pavement. And she described for me how he didn't come out of his house again. Maybe he became concerned about becoming involved, or he became medically disabled from the stress of calling 911 or whatever. And she describes how she both ran and walked. She described it in spurts through the Santa Fe town plan, through Santa Fe, from the area where the accident occurred, the location of the accident, to her mother's house in Santa Fe. Fortunately, she had a full recovery. Her life was saved. Her skull was closed. She recovered fully, and she actually became healthier after the accident, excuse me, than she had been before the accident. But she became a marathon runner. And she described for me how, after becoming such an excellent, runner, that she could not run the distance between where the accident was known to have occurred, and it was ultimately written into the police report, and where her mother lived. So, in other words, she had documentary proof that under the survival crisis of potentially bleeding to death from a skull fracture, she teleported spiritually. Now, I'm not an antagonist or an opponent of spiritual teleportation. I mean, after all, I've been waging my truth campaign about teleportation and time travel so that we can be operating at a more advanced level of functioning in the universe, so that we can fulfill our human and technical potential, so we can start doing regularly what our fathers and grandfathers' generation invented. But the problem with spiritual teleportation is, because it's only within the reach regularly of a small group of avatars in the world, and because it's only available to everybody during periods of life-threatening crisis where their full will to live is summoned, we can't be foolish and naive and assume that we can rely on spiritual teleportation to allow somebody to go to work or school or a nonprofit in the morning when they get up in the morning and they need to go from their home to wherever they're going that morning. If that was a capability of the human race, then we wouldn't have planes, trains, cars, automobiles, mopeds, and bicycles. People would just sit on their front porch and imagine where they want to go that morning, and would do so. So I'm often confronted, even sometimes angrily, by young people, and I think that's a great thing, about, well, you're a technicist and you're opposed to spiritual teleportation. I'm not. I'm just a realist that the mass public cannot spiritually teleport to get to work or school in the morning. If we could, we would be. So, in fact, we're going to have to, at least for several generations, rely on technical teleportation as a new form of human transport. We can't just sit in our front porch and spiritually teleport where we want to go. It's just not something that we're presently capable as the general public.
Johnny in London has a question for you. Go ahead, Johnny.
Good evening, Andrew. My first question was as a, I suppose the word is chrononaut, isn't it? Are you able to visit family members from different timescales, be it going back or forth into the future and past? And also,
there's nothing stopping us from doing that, or even if you go to where you are in a certain place in the past or future, if you go to that location in time space, time travel allows us to visit ourselves at a different age, older or younger. So yes, I can't say that it allows us to visit our former selves that we were in a previous lifetime, because that's an imperfect science. That requires the knowledge of who we were. But certainly when we can establish through conventional genealogy, let's say who our great-grandfather was on one of our lines, there's nothing stopping us from going there via teleportation, chronovision, plasma confinement, unless the time that we're visiting when that great-grandfather was alive occurred before the advent of teleportation, and then we can only go and visit our great-grandfather or cells at a younger age, etc., via chronovision or plasma confinement. So yes, we could literally have, I think what you're kind of thinking of, it's an interesting concept, and I think it's a pretty neat concept, which is having larger family reunions utilizing time travel.
Andrew, can we get you to speak a little louder? We're losing you a little bit.
Yeah, I'm just talking right into the phone. Yeah, I think what you're identifying is something that would be very, very significant, which would be to use time travel to have wider family reunions. That is to say, to commune with our ancestors and our descendants in a broader way than our immediate family.
Here's a listener question, and it's very detailed. My guess is she's probably read the bio, so before you answer it, I'm hoping you can give a background, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Let me read it to you. This is from Amy in Seattle, Washington. Can you tell us more about the Montauk chair? So the reason why I'm asking if you can, that's a very detailed question, is before we went on air, you were explaining how that is involved. So before you answer her question directly, can you describe the process and what the chair, how it, what it belongs, what it has to do with the process before just giving her the details about it?
Sure. The Montauk chair is a recumbent chair, like the chair that exists in dental offices. Above the head of the time traveler in the chair is an umbrella that looks like a photographer's umbrella. Behind the solar plexus of the person sitting in the chair, on the back of the chair, is a device that my father called a solenoid, but which my research has proven is essentially a magnetic transducer. Now, I challenge anybody, I've done this with people, if you doubt that your solar plexus is the chakra level that contains your will, where you will yourself to move from point A to point B, take your right index finger, whatever hand is dominant, lefty or righty, place it on your solar plexus, and then walk around your kitchen or living room. And you'll start to see that you actually locomote in time-space from that point in your anatomy. So behind that point was a magnetic transducer. At the foot of the person in the chair was a rocker arm shaped like a big fish hook that came up and directed a brown tube in the nature of a cathode ray tube at the face of the person in the chair. Beneath the seat was a CPU, a computer processing unit. And the way that the Montauk chair worked is we would have a cotton mask placed over our eyes and audio headsets placed in our ears, and then colored diodes would be placed over our eyeballs on the outside of the cotton mask, the cotton blinds that were placed over our eyes. And when the device was turned on, it would create a syncopated series of flashing light tones and syncopated musical tones that sounded somewhat like a PBX squall, the kind of the that we're familiar with from fax transmissions, but I think more musical than that. And after a number of seconds, about 10 seconds of that, we would experience an out-of-body experience where we would levitate out of our body spiritually and start moving rapidly foot first, or feet first, as if we were on, let's say, a luge run, the Olympic luge. And we would go through different convolutions of time-space, and then we would come out screaming foot first, or feet first, across a shiny black plane. And we would see something indistinct on the horizon of that plane, and then it would get closer and closer very quickly, and we would slam into it, and we were in a subjective moment of our own future. The basic application of the Montauk chair is to utilize magnetic transduction to accentuate the human perception of the individual's own future. So after hitting the future, we would be in it, not from the perspective of seeing it and looking around at ourselves, but of being ourselves in that future event. And then we would do whatever we were doing at that time in our future for 15, 20 minutes, and then we would collapse or fall asleep and wake up in the chair, and then individuals from DARPA would then debrief us about what we saw when we were in our own future. So, for example, if the television set was on and we were watching the president give the State of the Union address, they would ask, well, what was the name of the president? And I would say, for example, Barack Obama. And they would say, what did you say? Brick Obanja, what was that? One time I remember saying that I had seen President John F. Kerry, and the individual debriefing me said, did you say John F. Kennedy? You saw President John F. Kennedy in the future? And I said, no, I was at a rally for a man named John F. Kerry when he was running for president. And that was a rally that I would go on and attend in 2004 in downtown Portland, Oregon. Okay, so the Montauk chair is a magnetic transducer that was known simply as the chair in Project Pegasus. I probably took it's really hard to go back and identify precisely how many Montauk chair probes to my own future I took. I would say somewhere between 40 and 100. And I would do something and I would come back. So in intervening years, I've had all these deja vu episodes of what I saw, or not just saw, but pre-experienced in the Montauk chair. Now, the Montauk chair had two advantages. One is that the body of the time traveler remained back in the chair, hence free from immediate injury while being in the field time traveling, which wasn't true of all the other forms of time travel, like teleportation. You could die in the field. One boy lost his feet teleporting to Santa Fe. Another girl was blinded looking up at the crystal array that was propagating the hologram of one of the chronovisors. So the advantage of the Montauk chair is that the body of the individual stayed back in the chair. The second advantage was that the things that we were telling them were very accurate. We were giving them specific names, dates, and places from the future. I remember, for example, moving forward in time to an interaction with one of my sister-in-laws, one of my brother's wives, and I described back to them her name, her physical appearance, her ethnicity, and so forth. So we were naming actual people who would be in our lives in the future and all actual news events. So what happened was, by the early 80s, 15 years on after Project Pegasus had been initiated in the late 60s, a decision was made to launch Project Montauk as a spin-off of Project Pegasus to explore the net potentialities of the Montauk chair, doing things like giving psychoactive substances, herbs, and natural hallucinogens and artificial hallucinogens to the individual in the chair, and then to subject them to magnetic transduction, or fill the environment that the chair was in with radioactivity to see what kind of magnetic transduction took place, and hence what kind of journey to the future took place. So the Montauk literature of Nichols and Moon is about the second time travel program that was done around that Montauk chair. Now, when I was serving in the project, we always received kind of a briefing about the technology that we were then going to be exposed to. And I remember in the briefing about the chair, as we called it, not the Montauk chair, because after all, the Montauk project had not yet been started at Camp Hero near Montauk, Long Island. I remember them saying that the Montauk, or the chair, that the chair originated as the chair inside of an extraterrestrial craft that the pilot used to see where the craft was going. In other words, to see his future, because they needed to apprehend where the craft was going, to travel at the supersonic, indeed the interstellar speeds that they needed to get from their star systems to our own. And we, after we reverse engineered that device, we realized we could use it as a general enhancer of human psychic ability. It was basically the magnetic transduction of human psychic performance.
You've had several trips, as you mentioned, and I know two of them off the top of my head were extremely notable. One of them you actually have a photograph. Can you talk about some of the most notable trips that you remember?
Yeah, I basically had the privilege of encounters with Jesus of Nazareth, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln. And people say, well, Andy, that's a tall drink of water, because those are sort of signal historical personages in Western civilization. Exactly. Jesus, Washington, and Lincoln were three individuals in Western civilization in the American enabling environment that I found myself in, the post-war American experimental context. As a Christian-founded nation in which Washington and Lincoln were considered the two greatest U.S. presidents, much had been written about Jesus, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln, and they wanted to study their lives via chronovision to compare the chronovisor account with the historical accounts. I mean, hundreds of books had been written about Jesus, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln. So I had different kinds of time travel encounters with all three of those individuals. They were all three real people, but of different kinds. In the case of Jesus, in summer of 1972, my father invited myself and his longtime friend, Mary Constance Chavez, Connie Chavez, from Old Town Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm sure some of your Old Town Albuquerque listeners will remember Connie. She was almost a folkloric figure in Old Town Albuquerque. She was from the Chavez family that has had a distinguished history in New Mexico. In fact, she was a first cousin of Senator Dennis Chavez of New Mexico, the sister of Gilbert Chavez, for whom in Albuquerque elementary school was named. Connie was an old friend of my dad from when he had gone to New Mexico in 1953-54 to flight test the ramjet engine for Curtiss Wright. And he invited Connie and I to a viewing at the Sandia National Laboratory of a 16-millimeter black and white documentary film of a hologram that had captured the crucifixion of Jesus. So we sat there in a room full of about 15, 20 people for 20 or 25 minutes and watched the most excruciating thing I've ever seen, which is the crucifixion of a human being. And we saw Jesus' agony and death on the cross. When we left that viewing, my dad said to Connie, I don't know why you're remonstrating like this. And, he was just being crucified. And she said, Ray, just being crucified? I mean, they were crucifying my Lord. How do you expect me to behave? And Connie was actually hiding her face from looking at the screen of the movie. My dad said, I know, and it was horrible to watch, I know, but we also have footage that my team captured that 3 days later, angels appear, and there's a flash of light in Jesus' crypt. Angels appear. Jesus stands up, and the angels, he said angels, plural, not singular, and the angels help Jesus push the rock away from the mouth of his crypt. So my first encounter was with Jesus on the cross. I didn't see that footage that my dad described, but I'm mentioning it because I don't wish to proselytize, but I do wish to make the point that because that's what the team captured, that's part of natural history. Hence, my case would be that the resurrection of Jesus was a natural history event that it was wrong for the United States government to conceal. But at least I saw the crucifixion of Jesus, and I can describe it as a real event that followed the three New Testament accounts to a
What year was this? The exactly
that was in summer of 1972. We were shown footage of the crucifixion. Excuse me. Now, the encounter with Washington took place via chronovision in the fall of 1970. What happened was, when they were studying Washington's life, they saw me briefing him. And they went in and they got the sound, and they realized I was briefing him to retreat his troops from New York Harbor in August of 1776.
But you were asked to do that, right?
So then they figured out what to do, and so they decided to send me to do it. Excuse me.
Bless you.
I've been traveling. I've been without my Nexium. And so, faced with the conundrum of whether or not to send me there, they did. They decided to send me. And I can say, that Washington was the most impressive person that I've ever met. And then in the case of Lincoln, they sent me both to Gettysburg to see him give the Gettysburg Address, and they sent me to Ford's Theater to try to determine who shot him.
And was it John Wilkes Booth?
I never saw who shot him. In the same way that I didn't see him deliver the Gettysburg Address. I failed in my attempt to see who shot him.
Well,
but I did see Lincoln.
Can I ask you to go, while we're on the Abraham Lincoln topic, let's go talk about that trip in detail. What year did you arrive in that era? What exactly happened when you arrived? And, can you go through that in detail?
Well, in summer of 71, via Chronovision, I was sent to the mud in front of Ford's Theater on April 14th of 1865, about 6 or 7 times. In fact, every time I was sent to Ford's Theater, what happened there changed a little bit. Like, excuse me, like who was taking tickets at the table in the front of the theater. I would go in, and I described this actually in radio interviews before I learned why my inability to see the Lincoln's arrival and to see who shot Mr. Lincoln occurred. I was sent to Ford's Theater at the time right before the play Our American Cousin was beginning. Getting some water here. And but I've now learned, and I would go up and try to see who shot him. But I would always find that the Lincolns weren't there in their balcony seating. I now know that actually corresponds to the historical timeline.
Bless you.
In a way that I didn't understand, because the Lincolns arrived about 20 minutes late, and they received a standing ovation when they appeared in their balcony seating. So I was being sent via Chronovision before the play began, and I was looking for the Lincolns to see who shot him, and finding empty seats because they hadn't arrived at the theater yet. But one time I did see Mrs. Lincoln, followed by Abraham Lincoln, come into the lobby, and another time I was able to get up there and see Mr. Lincoln sitting in his seat, but then I was shooed away by a Union Guard. So I did not succeed in my mission to see who shot him. And people have said, well, were they actually trying to explore whether, let's say, his wife shot him? Because we know that Mrs. Lincoln carried a one-shot Derringer in her purse. I don't think that was the purpose of my mission. I think the purpose of my mission was to prove the data point that Abraham Lincoln got shot that night. In other words, I think in sending me behind the Lincoln's balcony seating, they wanted to just get a child to see that, okay, yes, he gets shot from behind in the balcony by John Wilkes Booth, not to disprove the John Wilkes Booth theory and blame someone else or establish some other form of the president's death. In other words, I think I was verifying an historical detail rather than trying to debunk one. And that was in the summer of 1971 via Chronovision, and those experiments were shut down in the beginning of the summer of 1971. I was at the the meeting of project personnel with some of the top people from Washington, where it was announced in the middle of the summer of 1971 that they would be shutting down Chronovision to the Past involving the children in the program, because just as I had experienced every time I was sent to Ford's Theater, every time they sent the same child or a different child to the same past event, it would change a little bit. So while they were gathering intelligence about, for example, past events via Chronovision, it wasn't reliable intelligence. And my dad was actually scowling in the audience. He was very angry that they would. And when we were in the parking lot, he actually said, at least it's intelligence, at least it's some information about what the past holds on that timeline. Okay, so the significance of that is that essentially by performing these Chronovision experiments in the early 70s, Project Pegasus proved the existence of the multiverse, the notion that we live in essentially ultimately a finite universe with a multitude, an uncountable proliferation of timelines.
Back to Lincoln, the second encounter, you have a famous photograph. I remember that's what basically ingrained you into my head and put you down in my list of people to interview. Can you describe the circumstances surrounding that?
Right. I was sent via plasma confinement, by a plasma confinement chamber that was located in East Hanover, New Jersey. The plasma confinement process was under the direction of Dr. Sterling Colgate when he was the president of New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology. It was a technology that he had pioneered. And my father took me out from our home in Morris Plains out to that brick building out near Ridgedale Avenue and School Road in East Hanover, New Jersey. It's still there. It's the building's being used as a daycare center behind a Presbyterian church now. And inside was a big lucite chamber into which Dr. Colgate would emit radioactive plasma, so that when I walked into the plasma, I would then experience a sort of a trap door effect, and they would temporarily embed me in a past event after about 30 seconds of violent wormholing. So on this particular day, my dad asked me whether I wanted to see Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, and I begged off. So Dr. Colgate suggested that my dad take me home and come back in a couple of weeks and see if I would then want to go see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. So we went back after a few weeks, and I was asked the same question, and I relented mostly to please my dad. And they dressed me as a Union Bugle Boy in a kind of a costume room that had hundreds of historical costumes. And I walked into the plasma. I experienced about 30 seconds of very violent wormholing with a kind of a cascading or branching effect through the quantum plenum. This is kind of a golden realm of light that exists between the timelines. And I was put down on the side of a road north of town, what is today in the area around Gettysburg College. And I walked into town, which ultimately what became or ultimately Washington Street. And as I was looking through the windows of shops in downtown Gettysburg, I got to the men's accessory shop, which is called a millinery shop. And I was looking through the window, and a man who has now been identified as the town constable and cobbler named John Lawrence Burns, who had previously been the town constable for the town of Emmitsburg and was known to go on these morning jaunts to help bring drunks and runaway kids home. And I guess...
Yeah, we lost you real quick. We are back live. You were talking about Lincoln.
Right. So I was looking into the shop, looking for some clothing, perhaps a jacket, because my teeth were chattering uncontrollably in the brisk November air of November 19th, 1863, which was the day that Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And a man identified as John Lawrence Burns, actually one of the citizen heroes of the Gettysburg battle. He had actually taken up a rifle and joined the Union cause and was wounded in the hip, came limping onto the wooden sidewalk, yelling, boy, what are you doing out here in the cold morning air like this? You're You're going to get sick, lad. You're going to catch your grip," which I presume was the flu or something. And he took me inside and he outfitted me with size 14 civilian street shoes. I mean, they were extremely large adult shoes, a medium-sized Union winter parka, and a hat. And then he said, "Well, that's the best I can do, son. The President of the United States is going to be here today, and I've got a speech to go to." And then I followed him out, down Emmitsburg Pike again, down Washington Street, along Evergreen Cemetery, and up to the eastern gate of Evergreen Cemetery. And I'm able to identify exactly where the dais was that Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. So we were just there in the early morning, and there were only a few people milling around. I had been trained to always avoid being conspicuous. And what happened is I went to the left side of the dais, and two women arrived, young women in sort of their Sunday best, and they began gossiping behind their fans at me like, "Well, look at this young carpetbagger," right? Because look what I was dressed in, a mix of both an official Union bugle boy uniform and then a mix of civilian and adult Union clothing. So I guess they were presuming that I had stolen some of the clothing, perhaps from the brave heroes who had just given their lives for the Union cause and 4 months previously in July of 1863 during the Battle of Gettysburg. So trying to avoid their gaze, I walked to the center of the dais, and I looked to the Pennsylvania farmer in bib overalls on my left. It was my father, except he looked younger than he did back at the time lab with Dr. Colgate. And I said, "Dad, what are you doing here? I didn't know you were coming." And he turned to me and said, "I'm not your pa, son," and kind of backed away from me. He later said back at the house that that's how he learned I would be in the project in the future, because when he was sent there years earlier, he had seen me there when I looked older to him, right? In other words, we were sent from two different times in real time to the same day and interacted as father and son. But he didn't want to let on that I was his son from the 1960s and 70s when he was in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on November 19th of 1863. So he feigned ignorance of who I was. And I found that very disconcerting. I kind of had a minor panic attack that happened. I then went to the left side of the stage again, and I was questioned by two Union officers about what my regiment was and where I was bivouacked. And when I told them I didn't that I didn't know where I was bivouacked or what my regiment even was, because I was a little bit touched in the head because I had seen too much of the fight, too much of the battle, they laughed so hysterically that they almost fell over laughing, and they were officers, okay? And so I thought, well, this is great. Now everybody around the stage where my dad said Lincoln would soon be arriving and giving the speech is now aware of my presence here. I think what I'll do is I'll walk about 100 paces away from the stage, and I'll turn my back and look in the opposite direction from where my dad said Lincoln would be arriving on horseback and disembarking from his saddle on the right side of the dais. And that event occurred behind me as I was standing there with my back to the dais, and I heard this uproarious cheer go up. It's the warmest cheer for a human being I've ever heard in my entire life. Abraham Lincoln was definitely a popular president in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on November 19th of 1863, maybe because he had just come there to memorialize the battlefield as a cemetery, part of the battlefield, or actually to consecrate the federal military cemetery north of the existing Evergreen civilian cemetery. And I essentially stood with my feet in a strange position because I didn't want anybody to see the large, oversized adult shoes that I had been given by Mr. Burns. And it was in that position that the photographer who took the famous picture known as the Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg captured me standing there in the center of the image. Josephine Cobb was the photo analyst at the Library of Congress who discovered Lincoln in the photograph in 1951.
Right.
In back, a couple of pixels back in the dais. And this was a photograph that had been donated to the Library of Congress in a cache of Civil War photographs that had once belonged to Matthew Brady, the legendary Civil War photographer. I think it was Brady who took the picture because I looked at the photographer, and it certainly looked like who I was able to later identify as Matthew Brady. But that image has been reproduced in Life magazine. I mean, I'm the only living person in Ken and Rick Burns' The Civil War because they showed that famous Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg at the segment of their famed documentary, The Civil War, in which they talk about the battle and then they narrate the Gettysburg Address. I'm standing there in Ken and Rick Burns' Civil War. So it is me. I'm the first time traveler of the future. But here's what we can say about to be in a photograph like that. But here's what we can say about that photograph. First of all, until the John Richter photograph was discovered in 2007 of Lincoln at Gettysburg, it was the sole surviving photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg. It is anomalous in the sense that my face is just a blob, and you can see my entire teeth and my right eye socket and cheekbone, because I was fading from view as the photograph was being taken, and it's the first known photograph to capture a time traveler from the future.
And
so
that's an extremely famous photograph. Anybody can just Google Andrew Basiago and you will find it. As a matter of fact, I found it with Lincoln, like you said, in the background and a little square drawn around it to prove that it's Lincoln. When we get back from break, I want to get some more details on that, as well as Washington. Plus, we'll talk about where people can find you. So much more with Andrew Basiago. Everybody stay tuned. We'll be back in 3 short minutes.
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
Welcome back to Hour 2 of Dr. J Radio Live. As you heard, the man himself, Art Bell, is returning to radio this Monday. This past weekend, I told you, everybody, he did a little special promo event at Zero International, where we had Preston Dennett, L.A. Marzulli, Yvonne Smith, and, of course, Rick Shaw. That special promo will be uploaded on my YouTube channel tomorrow. A very exclusive promo that he talked about the show, where he interacted with the audience, and so much more. It's about 18 minutes in length, and all of you can see it. All you have to do is go to drjradiolive.com and click on the YouTube link. As far as the videos and the interviews, I've been a little late catching up on them because I've been out of town this past week, but every interview that hasn't been posted will absolutely be posted, as will this. Remember, the only words you have to remember are Dr. J Radio Live, DRJ Radio Live. That is the same name for the .com, the domain, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, Google+, and YouTube. Same account, same name, same show. With that being said, let's turn it over to our guest to get some more information on where we can find him, where you guys can write to him, and, of course, upcoming appearances. Mr. Basiago, where can everybody find you? I think we lost Andrew. Let's get him back.
No,
Oh.
Dr. J, I'm here.
There you are. Let's go ahead and tell everyone where we can find you.
Well, I'm carrying out my time travel exploration with the public's participation, primarily at Project Pegasus, which is a group on Facebook. We're now at, I think, 15,300 members. And that's where I'm kind of directing everybody so I can take everybody's questions and make sure that nobody's left out. So that would be the location online where I'm answering questions about my time travel experiences, the technologies, the quantum paradoxes. So there's a rich literature there that's accumulated over the last 6 years regarding those topics.
And you're revamping your website, of course. Do you have any books available or anything else that
I'm working on a time travel trilogy that I hope to have completed by Christmas.
And do you have any upcoming appearances? Are we going to be speaking at any lectures?
No, I'm in fact focusing on the books.
Well, I think everybody out there listening is truly going to enjoy them. Now, right before we went to break, we were talking about that very famous photograph, which is everywhere. In it, you were wearing giant shoes, you were carrying something in your hand, and it looked like you were wearing a large shirt. What were the circumstances of when you arrived there? Because I remember you in a previous interview hearing that someone had given you shoes because you were barefoot and you had some cylinder to deliver.
Right. Between the plasma confinement chamber in East Hanover in 1972 And the agricultural land that really surrounded and was certainly north of the town of Gettysburg on November 19th of 1863, there was about 30 seconds of wormholing that was extremely violent. I was being tossed hither and yon by the very direction that the wormholing was branching in. So I lost my hat, I lost both of my shoes and one of my socks. And when I arrived, they always told us to, trained us to inspect ourselves to see in what state of habile or, dishabille we were in the historical event that they had sent us to. And so I kind of investigated, my apparel, and I realized I no longer had shoes. I had one sock, so I sat down on the ground, and I took off the remaining sock and threw it in the bushes, and then walked into Gettysburg barefoot on a very cold November morning. So my teeth were chattering uncontrollably when Mr. Burns, John Lawrence Burns, regaled me on the sidewalk there, and he took me inside the shop. And one detail that I would be remiss in not addressing is the fact that when I was standing there and he was looking for the shoes, and then he took me to the storeroom behind the main floor of the shop to get me the jacket, a woman in period clothing walked into the shop. But my time sink then went off. In other words, what I heard of their conversation was really dragged out moaning. In other words, my time sink had slowed down very, very much, and then rapidly corrected itself, and I heard basically sort of chipmunk-like chatter from them. In other words, I didn't hear the nature of their conversation because I had a time dilation and retraction effect that completely distorted the sound of their voices, slowed down and then rapidly sped up their voices. What I learned during my recent trip for the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, I was there shooting a segment for the Travel Channel on my journey to Gettysburg 43 years ago to what is now a point in time space that is 150 years distant from my own trip there, because I went there to arrive the day that Lincoln arrived. I went to the Historical Society, and I also walked the shops on the northern side of Ehrenberg Avenue there, which is what we today call the northern part of Emmitsburg Pike. And I learned that the woman who entered the store was the wife of the proprietor. The proprietor of the shop was a man by the name of David Kendallhart, who was the town council president, town lawyer, and town shoemaker, for whom Mr. Burns was town constable or policeman and cobbler. In other words, he patched together the worn used shoes, like the very large men's brown street loafers that he equipped my feet with. And the woman was the wife of David Kendallhart by the name of Eliza Ann Bowen. I actually found her gravestone and put a rose on it, because what I learned up at the one of the Gettysburg Historical Society museums and the Adams County Museum is that the Kendallharts, Mr. and Mrs., were the directors of the Gettysburg station of the Underground Railroad. So when I saw her taking John Lawrence Burns to task for equipping me with the used shoes from the shelving unit at the back of the shop and then giving me a free jacket, I initially had thought, because I had not heard what they were saying when I went there because of this time dilation and acceleration effect, I had thought that she was just taking him to task for giving away free merchandise. In fact, he was giving away merchandise that in all likelihood was being kept there to equip fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. And that's when I took the rose over to her. I found her gravesite in Evergreen Cemetery and laid a rose there, because the Kendallharts were not being cheap with their goods. They were protecting their surplus goods to equip the freedom that would be enjoyed by fugitive slaves coming north. And I was very touched by that fact when I realized what she must have been saying to him, which was something that must have been in the nature of like, John, what are you doing? We're going to need we're going to need those jackets for our slaves that we send on to the next station or whatever. You know, a lot of them are going to be running through the countryside in the middle of the night, John. Don't give away the jackets, you know. So that's what I learned about the Kendall Hearts, and I was very moved by that. But I also got some of the background of John Lawrence Burns, the fact that he was not only a volunteer into the War of 1812 and the Battle of Gettysburg, but that he adopted the daughter of the town ne'er-do-well and was a very charitable man. And what did we see in his behavior towards me? He equipped me with free clothing when I stumbled into Gettysburg as a time traveler from 1972, with my teeth chattering uncontrollably in the brisk morning air of November 19th, 1863. So I was able to gather a lot of facts from that time in Gettysburg that matched up with what I had directly experienced there. For example, the charity of John Lawrence Burns and ultimately of Eliza Ann Bowen.
That cylinder, what was that? Did you pick up that cylinder from that era in the 1800s, 1863, or is that something you brought from the 70s?
Well, that's another one of the, let me just share the quantum synchronicities regarding the trip to Gettysburg and the photograph. I think you're referring to this, what seems to be a cylinder that I'm holding in my hand.
Yes.
Still as I'm standing there with my left leg just pointed forward toward the camera, and then my right foot to the right. That wasn't a cylinder. That was a cylindrical piece of paper. What that was a letter that my father had handed me as I was walking into the plasma confinement chamber, which was a letter to Navy Secretary Gideon Welles to offer me aid and assistance in the field should I become in need of aid and assistance while time traveling to Gettysburg. So I had just rolled up that piece of paper. Actually, it was in a cylindrical form. It was a scroll. When my dad handed it to me, it was actually starting to get kind of warped from the perspiration in my hand as it was getting warmer and warmer that day. But so by the time that Lincoln arrived, and I faded from view as the photographer captured that image of me standing there, and of course Lincoln behind my right shoulder on the dais, that paper cylinder had become somewhat dilapidated, and that was actually a letter to Navy Secretary Welles. Now that created the first quantum synchronicity about my trip to Gettysburg. I never had to surrender that letter to a Union officer to get the assistance of Navy Secretary Welles. But in 2011, I was on a speaking tour of Maui, and of the Hawaiian Islands, and I ran out of money in Maui, and I was put up by my friend Janet Letson, who is a direct lineal descendant of who? Of Navy Secretary Gideon Welles of Lincoln's cabinet. So I don't know how many years, I think it was 149 years later, I was actually offered aid and assistance in the field while I was lecturing about going to Gettysburg by one of Gideon Welles' descendants. Another quantum synchronicity of the photograph is that Josephine Cobb, the photo analyst at the Library of Congress who found Lincoln in the image, is the great aunt of William Stillings, one of my fellow Mars jumpers. In other words, literally a fellow U.S. chrononaut. So I think there was something about the fact that I had an impact on actual events that were occurring, like the creation of that photograph so many years ago, over 100 years ago, now 150 years ago, that somehow the event itself got deeply embedded in the time-space continuum, so that these synchronicities literally surfaced in my ordinary life, in my life.
Now, I'm going to go back to the earlier encounter because, see, you obviously played an integral role going to the Civil War to actually hand a letter to the Secretary of the Navy. Now, you did something similar during the Revolutionary War where you were ordered to go tell Washington something, correct?
Right. I never did surrender that letter instructing Navy Secretary Gideon Welles to help me if I needed aid and assistance in the field, but I did bring it there. And of course, then I got his assistance in 2011 from one, I think the great-great-granddaughter, Janet Lesson, is my dear friend in Hawaii, actually on the island of Maui.
Yes,
is the descendant
exactly
of Welles.
She is. Yes, she's
a
good friend of mine too. Her husband, Sasha.
Right, the wife of Dr. Sasha Lesson, right, the anthropologist. And so what happened with Washington is, as a result of them using chronovision and studying Washington's life and making the accidental discovery that I had briefed Washington to retreat from New York Harbor, they thought, well, what do we do? Since we know that Washington retreats from New York Harbor, the Revolutionary Army is saved, the Revolutionary War is won, and the U.S. becomes a country, should we or should we not send Andy to brief him now that we have this footage of him briefing him? And they decided to do what I call double green lighting, which is direct the event in the direction it was going. Do the double yes. In other words, send me and have me do the briefing. My father did the same thing when I said, well, what does my future hold? And he said, well, you do attend, after law school, you attend Cambridge. And I said, you mean Harvard and Cambridge, Mass? And he said, no, the University of Cambridge in Cambridge, England. And he said, he then double green lighted it by saying, so if you're invited to go to Cambridge, accept the invitation and go. Okay. So in the case of Washington, they found the evidence in the quantum hologram, in the time-space continuum that I had briefed Washington. So they then briefed me to brief him, and I memorized this script of what I had to tell him to retreat from New York Harbor. It went something like this. It was, with General Washington, we are time travelers from your future. We've been sent here by the government in the 1970s, 200 years into the future. That's the government of the very country that you found. That country will be called the United States of America. It will be regarded as the greatest country in the history of civilization. You, as a result of your leadership during the Revolution and during the early years of the governing of that country, will be known as the father of that country, as the father of your country. Indeed, the capital city of that great nation will be called Washington in your honor. But, sir, and this is where I had to memorize the tough word, but, sir, none of those propitious things will happen unless you retreat your troops immediately from New York Harbor. So they were basically giving me the responsibility to make sure that the revolution was won. And why were they relying on a school child from New Jersey with a superb memory? Because they had to use children in the chronovisors. So they selected a child. When we did the game where you report back the numbers to the instructor, I remembered back and counted, reported back a number that stretched to 84 numerals. Okay, so I remembered and can now say 45 years later what I was schooled to instruct Washington in saying, and that was basically the script. And he said, well, time travelers spoke somewhat like Prince Charles, very kind of King's English, and the cavalier attitude that he was inculcated with by his father's generation, which was known as the Cavalier generation. He said, Andrew, it's Andrew, right? Yes, I thought you said Andrew. Time travels from our own future. This is a concept that I must say it mystifies me greatly. What are you actually, lad? Are you an angel? Are you an angel from the future? Why are you giving me this military advice? I mean, you walk into my encampment here in Brooklyn Heights and you regale some of my men that you have an important message for General Washington. And now here you are sitting in my tent and you're telling me that you're a time traveler from the future. I can't even grasp what you mean, son. What is a time traveler? What's time travel? And I said, well, this is what I've been instructed to say. I said, well, sir, in the same way that rather than walking, you can get on the back of a horse or in a carriage and be towed by horses from point A to point B. In the future, we develop ways of utilizing the kinds of experiments that Benjamin Franklin's working on in things like electricity to send an individual from point A to point B over vast distances, not just of space or land, but of time. And he says, well, that just seems just utterly incomprehensible. I still don't understand what you're saying. And so then he cups his hand and he lifts his head back in a cavalier way as a young Alexander Hamilton is walking by. I'm talking about like a 19-year-old Alex Hamilton in 1776, right? And he says, say, Alec, these lads tell me that they're time travelers from our own future. Tell me, have you ever heard such a thing? And Alexander Hamilton, being the studious politician that he later emerged as, the cautious politician that he emerged as, except for his gunfight with Aaron Burr, said, no, General, I don't believe that I ever have. Heard of a time travel. So Washington turns back towards me again, an utterly impeccably dressed, utterly charismatic figure of high intelligence, and incredible bearing with a golden light surrounding him. He was the most remarkable person I've ever met. And he said, "No, Andrew, really, now you must be angels from elsewhere, correct? Giving me an important message from heaven?" And I said, "No, sir, we're time travelers from your own future." And he goes, "Well, prove it. You're asking me to retreat my army from New York Harbor, and I don't know whether I should. So I want you to prove it." And I said, "Well, General Washington, we knew what you would say." We did, because we had picked up the chronovisor images of him saying this stuff to me. And I handed him a laminated 8.5 by 11 piece of paper that had a 2-dimensional hologram on it, like the holograms that were then appearing, that is to say, in the early and mid-'70s, on the cover of the National Geographic, where you have a rudimentary hologram, a graphic 2-dimensional hologram. And I said, "Surely you must agree, General Washington, that this particular publication here is not from your time, but is indeed must be from the future, just by the looks of it," which is what I've been instructed to say to him, sort of in his vernacular. And he said, "Well, yes, I think that I must quite agree with you. This is certainly something that I should show old Ben. And this can't be from my time." And then he looked away just for a few seconds and stood bolt upright, and without looking at me said, "I shall order the retreat immediately," and confidently strode out of his tent. We then went down to the grassy swale that went from Brooklyn Heights down into the harbor, and we stood there at dusk and even after nightfall and watched his several thousand troops retreat from New York Harbor. And every third or fourth young man, they were very young soldiers, would peel off from the line of men streaming up to Brooklyn Heights on their way to Manhattan, which is where they retreated from New York Harbor, in an event that even David McCullough cites in his book 1776 remains a mystery as to why that famous nighttime retreat from New York Harbor was ordered by Washington, as if as a result of some act of prophecy that he should do so. Every third or fourth soldier would peel off and look at us and say, "So, are you boys angels? Are you the ones who told us that we have to leave the harbor?" And I was really struck by how young and how naive they were. But anyway, so this is the complexity of the true history of U.S. time travel, which is to say that a third grader from Morris Plains, New Jersey, in a gifted and talented student program that had been used to decant children into a secret defense project involving time travel, briefed General George Washington to retreat from New York Harbor on behalf of the Nixon administration. That's how complicated the reality of quantum access and the use of past and future event has been secretly within the United States government.
Johnny's got an international listener question. Go ahead, Johnny.
Yeah, it's Peter in Cambodia he's called in before in the past. He's asking Andrew, was he part of MK Ultra, and does he bring objects back, or are they placed in space-time?
Well, we were clearly involved in a form of brainwashing, which is called state learning, where we would go to the learning lab, they would hypnotize us, we would be involved in project activities in the learning lab or at local and even not just New Jersey-based, but Ohio and New Mexico-based defense labs. And then before we left school that day, for example, if they teleported us back to the morning of that day after spending hours, days, weeks, or months, let's say in New Mexico, we would then be given a small dose of scopolamine, which when you give a child an LD50, 50% of a lethal dose of scopolamine for a child of that age and size, they forget everything they immediately repress, sort of temporarily forget everything that happened 8 hours before and after administration. So when we would wake up the next morning on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays and go over to the learning lab rather than remain in our main classroom, we were being subjected to a form of mind control. But I hasten to state that it wasn't kind of mind control that makes you an instrument of somebody else's agency. It was simply brainwashing so we wouldn't be blabbing about what we were doing to our mothers, to our siblings, to the kids in the neighborhood. Did we put things in the past? Generally speaking, we were honoring the prime directive of Star Trek fame, and we weren't altering the past or future by either taking or leaving objects. There was one exception. Obviously, I took the letter to Gideon Wells on my trip to Gettysburg, but also we participated in one probe via chronovision where we carried these devices that were about the size of a laptop, where we'd flip open the lid of the device and a radio sonde would pop up at a 60-degree angle towards the sky. And we were sent to an ancient Arizona location where we were instructed to leave one of those up against a cliff or some other rocky outcropping or some nondescript location, because they were trying to put those tracking devices in the ancient past. And in fact, I was present when one of the young team leaders in the project threw one of those radio sondes on the stage at the school and said something sarcastic, because it had been found in Arizona as an artifact and had been donated to the Smithsonian, and we were now encountering one of the radio sondes we had left as an anomalous ancient artifact. I've actually never discussed that on radio before. So yes, in one probe we left a tracking device in the prehistoric past, but generally we were honoring the principle of the prime directive of non-interference with the evolution of the time-space continuum.
How did you get back from when you went to 2,000 years ago? You said to see Jesus, the Revolutionary War, Civil War. What device, if you use the Montauk chair to travel there, what did you use to come back to the 70s?
Well, it varied. In the case of Tesla teleportation, while we were teleporting, we could only teleport to times after, if we teleport to the past, we could only teleport to times after the advent of Tesla teleportation, namely its reduction to practice around 1967-68. Then as the years ensued, we could have a little bit more of a time envelope to play with, but we could certainly Tesla teleport to the far future, because Tesla teleportation defines the future. In fact, I was regularly teleporting through a Stargate device in summer of 1972 after the probe to Gettysburg in spring of 72 to the year 2045, where teleports were as commonplace as elevator landings and bus stops are in our time and place. Now, in the case of the Montauk chair, our body remained in the chair, so we merely woke up once our spirit was reconnected to our body. In the case of chronovision, either the hologram collapsed and we spontaneously found ourselves back on the stage of the device, or if we had been in for more than 15 minutes, a density effect would occur where we were stuck in, for example, that past event, and they would insert a portal into the hologram to physically extract us. We would run through the portal. And in the case of plasma confinement, that temporary field effect, that localized quantum field effect, would just wear off, and we would spontaneously transition back to the present. In other words, we would pop back into view in the plasma confinement chamber in East Hanover. So it varied, and they were working on forms of time travel that didn't require the presence of a device in the past to enable us to explore the modern, medieval and prehistoric past.
Because there's different timelines, do you think that one person seeing the future would be different than another person's view of the future?
Well, I think ultimately what we saw when we were in the past or future was governed by our age and experience and our intelligence and our what I call our PQ, not our IQ, but our PQ, namely our perceptual quotient. People vary greatly on their ability, for example, to see something they've never seen before and recognize it. In fact, during the Age of Discovery, some Aboriginal people couldn't see the Western sailing ships because they had never seen them before. Some could. So that varies probably based on genetic factors among both Aboriginal and contemporary populations. So I'm sure that what was seen varied, but we were prized because we were going to be seeing more accurately what we were sent to see, and we did.
What's, to your knowledge, from everybody else that participated in this experiment, what do you think is the furthest back, or what you were told is the furthest back in time someone was able to go to?
Well, Project Pegasus was highly compartmentalized, where even the experiences of kids in my group of 10 that I hadn't done something with, I hadn't gone on a project activity with, were sometimes not reported to the other kids on the same team. So I can only speak as to how far back in time I went, which was 100 million years via chronovision to a hot, humid, red Earth, and they stated it was an Arizona location. I presume that it was, let's say, the area around Sedona, Arizona, about 100 million years ago. And I walked along a red earthen ridge line kind of up a hill for about 10 minutes. And I looked over my right into this grassy valley, and I saw two long-necked dinosaurs chomping on tall grass that was about 20 feet tall, what looked like lawn grass that was 20 feet tall. So when we came back, Jack Pruitt explained to us that we had been sent on a physio-virtual basis to 100 million BC, but at the same time we could still be seen by the project technicians because they had propagated 100 million BC in the area around the red earth environment of Sedona, Arizona, when there were dinosaurs there, holographically. And they were watching the hologram as we walked through that environment. They were tracking us. So that was to give us an additional measure of safety when we were in some of these very ancient locations. So they broke us in by sending us very far into the past. That was only the second chronovisor probe that I went on. The first was that was at the chronovisor at Morristown. The first probe I did to the past, the first chronovisor probe I did at all, was to a Civil War battle as it was taking place. And I actually had to hide under a berm when the Confederate forces overwhelmed the Union forces that I was standing amidst. And I actually was looking up from this berm, from behind the berm, at the Confederate troops as they were jumping over the berm with their bayonets fixed, yelling the Yebel Rel, which was blood-curdling. So,
from the best of your knowledge, Andrew, do you know if any of these 10 other children that were with you are dead or survived, or they're still about? And
well, we know that we've lost one of them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit more about that situation?
Well, we know from my briefing with Jack Pruitt in 2003 in Santa Fe that there were medical side effects during the advent of teleportation. And I'm not advocating that teleportation be introduced in broad societal terms until we get clear answers about these medical consequences. The adults, including my father, were developing heart valve defects that the children didn't develop because our heart tissues were more pliable. The adult heart valves and so forth were more rigid, and so the vibratory effects of the Tesla teleportation were damaging heart valves. And in fact, my dad lived from 1977 to his death in 1990 with a St. Jude's cuff operating to actually fire his mitral valve, which had been surgically removed during open heart surgery, when it was found that the flaps of the mitral valve had fused like a butterfly's wing. And in fact, Dr. Sestatus at Cedars-Sinai, one of the more distinguished heart surgeons in the world, came out after my dad's first of 2 open heart surgeries in which he had 11 segments of vein, 11 bypasses placed in his chest cavity, that, your dad had this strange anomaly involving his mitral valve, so we took it out and put in a St. Jude's cuff. And I didn't know at that time, not thinking back to our experiences on Pegasus, that my dad's heart valve was in fact damaged by the teleportation. The adults who were the children, the adult survivors of the childhood experience of teleporting, we've been developing a disease in adulthood that mimics diabetes. And we've had difficulty with rapid weight gain and blood sugar regulation. And one of my peers on the project, Glenn Pruitt, the son of Jack Pruitt, who was one of the team leaders and one of my colleagues and my father's close colleagues on the project, passed away in 2007, I believe, at 700 pounds. So yes, we've lost some of the chrononauts from heart disease and from uncontrolled obesity resulting from the biomedical consequences of our time travel experiences.
Andrew, are you still in touch with any of these chrononauts right now?
Well, I found 6 or 7 of the kids who were trained with me and had common experiences, and I should note, I don't know if I mentioned earlier, that all of them remembered the Montauk chair being in our classroom, and the Montauk chair became the signal technology of Project Montauk, and we need look no further than the trilogy, the Montauk series by Nichols and Boone, to see how significant the Montauk chair was as one of these, cardinal time travel technologies that emerged at this time. Well, those individuals, and I will be naming their names in my book, all affirmed the presence of the Montauk chair in the classroom that we were being given specialized training as kids, as gifted and talented kids. The GATE program, the Gifted and Talented Education program that we were part of, that I'm alleging ultimately led us down, at least some of us, down the rabbit hole of applied quantum physics. Well, they all affirmed the presence of the Montauk chair in the learning lab. Right there, once that happened, I thought, wait a minute, this takes it out of the subjective realm of my own memory. Here I have found these people. They went on to, prosperous lives as adults and distinguished themselves in different professions. I met up with them as a result of the advent of not just the internet, but of Google. I Googled them and found them. And here I have all of them remembering a time travel device being in the classroom in which we received our specialized instruction as gifted kids. Then I got the one boy to remember the teleporting and the girl to remember being taken up to ITT Defense for the chronovisor probe to 2013 to remotely view the U.S. Supreme Court building, and we found it under about 100 feet of brackish water, okay? So that really convinced me early on that, look, if the Montauk chair was in the classroom, QED, we were time traveling. And I stopped searching for other explanations at that point, like the fact that I had a delusional disorder, or I was fantasizing, or my memory had been influenced by films I had seen, and these kinds of real mental effects that occur in people's lives. Our understanding of reality is a mix of what we experience, what we think about what we experience later, what we dream, what we remember dreaming, the dreams that were based on facts that happened, the dreams that were based on fantasy, etc. And also biochemical changes as we age. There's a link between hormones and memory. So as we age, memories get corrupted. But what we know that happens in males after 35, as testosterone begins to slowly decline, is that their childhood traumas come forward, just as they come forward typically when women reach around age 30. So I was right on schedule. If the range is from 35 to 40, where men start revisiting their traumatic childhood memories, I began actually making a diary of my memories of Pegasus at age 37 and a half.
I was going to say, we have under 15 minutes, about closer to 13 minutes left. Johnny's got a question for you. Go ahead, Johnny.
Andrew, has the Montauk project today, has it expanded globally, TV advertising, or has it died a death? Is it a continuum or is it an end?
Well, that's really tough. It's a tough question to answer because I left Project Pegasus at the end of the summer of 1972 in real time, although I had spent time in the past and future and actually some project summer in 73. So I was dismissed from the project with the other people in my team just as an ordinary matter at the end of the summer of 72 in real time. I was then brought into the Mars jump room, which I served in from August of 1980 until May of 1984. I did my last project activity in spring of 1989. They had me go to Socorro, New Mexico, and be subjected to this big electromagnet to fix my position in time-space after I had done, the 4 years of time travel and the 4 years back and forth to Mars about 40 times via a time travel device. So I don't know, but I can say this. I think it's virtually certain that after the experimental phase of Project Pegasus, I think what they probably did, this is just an educated guess, but it's a highly educated guess because I've spent years investigating my experiences in the project. I think what they did is they took teleportation and they established teleports at secret hangars, that is to say, need to know only, top secret hangars at U.S. military bases around the world to shuttle U.S. officials around the world. I know from the jump room program that the British and the Russian also had teleporters and chronovisors and jump rooms. As to the chronovisors, I'm almost certain that, as was depicted in the feature film Deja Vu, I think they probably embedded the chronovisor potential within the foreign and domestic surveillance apparatus of the national security community of the United States and other leading countries, presumably also the United Kingdom, Russia, and so forth. The real $64,000 question that is not known is that because some of the project principals, that is to say the Project Pegasus principals like Donald Rumsfeld, later went on to both become more powerful defense officials, but then also be involved in the revolving door of corporate employment, of private employment during periods of public defense-related employment for the U.S. and other world governments. And for example, is a member of the Carlyle Group. Was some of this technology, I mean, the $64,000 question is, was some of this technology revived and taken further utilizing corporate cutouts like the Carlyle Group? And the reason I mention corporate cutouts, that's a term from the Iran-Contra scandal, the notion of using, let's say, corporate or foundation grant money and utilizing the cover of corporate organization to conceal intelligence and defense activities that are not revealed to Congress in its oversight function, is that I know to a personal certainty, because of my interaction with my late father and Sterling Colgate, who was a scion of the Colgate-Palmolive fortune, that Project Pegasus was undertaken under DARPA, but outside of the purview of Congress, because it was financed by the Colgate-Palmolive fortune that was accumulated by the Colgate dynasty, of which Stir was, that is to say, the nickname of Sterling Colgate, of which Stir was a scion, a descendant. So because they were utilizing corporate, independent, private grant money from the Colgate Foundation to fund Pegasus, I wonder whether Menem took the time travel program further when Colgate-Palmolive became the Menem Corporation, or Menin Corporation, and also whether individuals like Donald Rumsfeld and the Bushes, when they became president, may have taken the time travel project further in a private, corporate, corrupted, opportunistic context in the private sector.
Do you think that would be something like DARPA, the Department of Advanced Research Program Agency? And also, my last question to you before we sort of finish on time is, being a member of DARPA in the past, what's your take on DARPA today, and specifically the HARP program?
Well, I was treated well by certain people in the program, like my father and Captain Ernest Garcia, certainly Connie Chavez, who were attempting to protect the children of the project, including myself. But in adulthood, I have to look back at the brutality of the brainwashing, the illegality and unconstitutionality of involving us involuntarily in labor and not paying us, of, for example, making military officers out of us as children, and later during the Mars program as as teenagers, not even yet adults, and not paying us, not benefiting us under the the military system of the GI Bill of Rights, of being provided a salary and medical, dental, educational, and burial benefits. And I recognize that we were not only abused, but we were cheated, and we were also cheated in a way that was illegal at the time because it violated the 13th Amendment, which you're undoubtedly aware was a post-Civil War amendment to the U.S. Constitution that banned slavery and involuntary servitude, except in cases of as punishment for a capital offense. And I'm very offended by what happened in that sense. People have thought that I've been a little bit too friendly to the CIA about all this. I believe that my father and his generation of DARPA scientists knew sin in the sense that they were ignoring the brutality that was occurring to secure our silence and to make us pliable project participants, but also that in overarching terms, the cosmic injustice was clearly a decision that must have been made by Rumsfeld, that the children of the project should not be paid or benefited in any way, because to do so would create a paper trail. That was condign injustice, and so I believe that DARPA has known sin, that the CIA is a renegade, out-of-control agency. And that's one of the reasons why I've come forward, and that's indeed one of the reasons why I'm seeking the U.S. presidency as an independent candidate, is we need to rein in the activities of the U.S. intelligence community and defense community and put them again underneath the oversight function of the U.S. Congress as the representative of the self-governing will of the American people.
I think there's a lot that's going on that is not being governed. It's almost as if there's a sovereign nation. Before the show ends, we have a caller that called in fairly late, so I'd like to give him an opportunity to ask a question. Area code 419. What's your name?
Yeah, it's Frog. I finally got through. I had to use the wife's cell phone here.
Go ahead and ask a question.
I got the question of, are you sure that the country's always been called the United States of America?
No, I can tell you this based on my own research, and that is that the Stars and Stripes was originally the ship flag of the British East India Company. We know that. We know that. We know that Washington had a checkered past in instigating the French and Indian War, and hanging deserters. No. I'm answering your question, sir. And that he was hanging deserters at Valley Forge. And we also know that there were 13 presidents during the 13 years that were under the Articles of Confederation prior to the presidency of George Washington. So, in fact, in answer to your question, I think it's a colorable claim that we might have been known as something else besides the United States of America. I don't know what that is, but
what do you think the program is developed into now? Because obviously it sounds, I'm sure they weaponized it to some degree because, like you said, they used child labor to create, child labor to use soldiers, young soldiers that weren't paid, no benefits. What do you think is happening now?
I think that probably the United States government has both implemented the teleports secretly at military bases, is using chronovision to perform domestic and foreign surveillance of individuals outside the ordinary bounds of time and space. In other words, they can tune in a location and see what was done there 5 years ago or 5 years later in the future. And I think that probably there is a thorough cadre of U.S. naval personnel who are both, we know from the Gary McKinnon data, occupying a U.S. naval space fleet outside of the bounds of the Earth. And also, I think that U.S. naval personnel are involved in an elaborate time travel program to the past and future and are actively gathering information even about individuals. In other words, I believe that people are being identified as political persons of interest as a result of our quantum access capability, because I know that Presidents Bush, Clinton, and Obama were apprised of their presidencies decades in advance as a result of the U.S. time-space program having emerged in the early 1970s and given the intelligence community and the defense community this information of who would be president. So I believe the program is ongoing in even a broader way than I encountered as a child participant. That's my guess, but I don't know to a personal certainty whether that's the case.
I would think so, especially continuing on something 40 years later, just like people who were working on extraterrestrial craft 30, 40 years ago, or even longer than that. I would think that things are much more advanced. I mean, look at all these devices that we have now that were science fiction 20 years ago. Who would have thought you would have a personal computer in your hand anywhere you go, or you could see someone on FaceTime? It just, again, we're advancing at such a rapid pace. I couldn't imagine that it wouldn't be broadened. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask you this big question. You obviously came forward for a reason because you've gone through so much and you wanted to tell the world. What would you like to tell all the people out there as a sort of a lesson you've learned for them to prevent themselves from getting harmed the way you were?
Well, I think you have to be very circumspect about volunteering your children into government programs. But let me make a broader point, because we've dwelt so much on time travel technologies and experiences in this interview. And that is what I would want your listeners to know. That is the belief, and I share it, of Dr. Robert Beckwith, that implementing what he called levitated magnetic teleportation, which is the Tesla teleportation that opens up vortal tunnels in time-space, is and should be viewed as the most important environmental issue of our time, because when we implement it, we will eliminate 60% of the greenhouse gases that can even create climate change. So regardless of what your position is on climate change, 60% of the greenhouse gases that human industry emits into the atmosphere every year can be interdicted by simply eliminating the internal combustion engine. How will we do that? We will implement Tesla teleportation in a global program of technology transfer in which ultimately a U.S.-led global coalition of teleports will administer the large teleports, and then we'll start breaking them down into smaller and smaller teleports at the city, the regional, metropolitan, village, and neighborhood level. Okay, so that may seem farcical right now. That may seem like an unusual environmental issue to pick up, especially by somebody like me, trained as an environmental lawyer, as a Cambridge-educated environmental scholar. But it is, in fact, it should be viewed as the principal environmental issue of our time, because it's the most effective. Introducing Tesla teleportation will be the most effective agenda lever that we have to deal with climate change. And so that would be my message tonight.
We literally have a little over a minute left. You gave your message. If you have one final piece of words you'd like give, if one final thing, plug in your Facebook page again, and anything final thing you'd like to say before we close.
Yeah, I would just remind your listeners that, and my fellow human beings, that as Mark Twain said, truth is stranger than fiction. That's actually a Twain quote. And we have to remember that during the Cold War, trillions of dollars were spent on secret projects utilizing the minds of the most brilliant physicists and engineers, undertaking the development of military technologies, much of it in New Mexico, without the purview of Congress or the knowledge of the American people or the people of the world. So before saying that I'm a fraud or a kook, as I was recently called on Facebook, I'm telling the truth. I mean, I spent from age 17 to 33 educating myself, and I hold 6 post-secondary academic qualifications. I practiced law without a disciplinary history of any kind in the state of Washington for almost 20 years. I have no reason to make this information up. I am telling the truth. So we have to remember the context in which these time travel technologies secretly emerged. They emerged in the Cold War context in which trillions of dollars were spent on this and similar projects.
And with that being said, everybody, thank you so much for listening. Of course, thanks to our guest, Andrew Basiago, to our Dr. J Radio Live team. There are too many names to thank. Keith Rowland, Art Bell, and again, you, the listeners, disclosure is in your hands. Remember, Tuesday night, we'll be back. Art Bell will be on this Monday. And with that being said, Dr. J is signing off.